Hello! Now the question for today is, has Audi finally made a decent RS coupe? The car you see here is the new RS5. That is the 450 horsepower V6 twin turbo version as opposed to the previous 450 horsepower V8 version, and it hopes to improve on that previous car's slightly lacklustre reputation. It's a weird one this, isn't it? Because Audi's got very strong heritage. The UR Quattro of the 1980s was an iconic car. It can link back to that. It is a very clever company, it's got a very strong brand, and yet somehow it hasn't quite managed to nail this fast coupe thing, has it? I did the launch for that original 2010 RS5, and I remember being really impressed by the V8 engine. That was lovely, but overall the car was just a bit dull. I think the most exciting thing that happened on that launch was being driven into by a Spaniard. One of the other problems is that the other cars in its sector are really, really good. So you've got the BMW M4, which is just on its way out, but still a very, very nice car indeed. You've got the Mercedes-AMG C63S with a big V8. You've got things like the Lexus RCF and even the Nissan GTR, and all very, very strong characters in those cars. You know, they all have a real USP. Weirdly, in that sector, Audi still hasn't managed to quite nail it. Now with this new one, they've trimmed quite a bit of weight out of it, 30 kilos I think out of the engine alone, which is very impressive. It's got a new kind of more sculpted look about it. You see these character lines on the bonnet. I'm not entirely sure about that. I think Audis look better when they have a kind of clean look about them. Each to their own though. People seem to love it. Everywhere I've been with this car, people go, nice car mate. So Audi fans love it. It's the main thing I suppose. Things that set it apart, now obviously it's got a much more aggressive grille, the Quattro script there, just to hammer the point home. You'll have probably spotted the box arches here. They're 15mm wider, and these little vents on the side of the lights kind of accentuate that. Gives it that real kind of muscular stance. Now the RS5 is a 61 grand car at basic list. This one is a press car special, so it's 78 grand, which is pretty astonishing really. Among the extras are these 20-inch wheels, 2 grand. 400 quid to have your calipers painted red. Now, I'm not sure about these wheels. They kind of, even in that size, they look a bit lost in the wheel arches, and they're of this directional design. I don't know why people do this. It's seems to be a bit of a fashion thing at the moment. Personal thing. It just really winds me up because they go one way on one side of the car and the other on the other. And to me, it just messes with my head. Each of their own. There are other designs available in the range. Silver wing mirrors, standard kind of performance Audi features. Not sure about this silver window lining, but you can have it in black if you want. Coming around the back, it's got that kind of wide arch Audi stance. Again, a very clear kind of visual reference to the UR Quattro. That's a good thing. How can it not be? You know, that's a classic, well, definitive Audi even. So I think it's good that Audi's celebrating its history in that way. We've got these oval exhausts, another RS styling trademark, and they're proper exhausts as well. They're not stupid bumper trims. Even the R8 gets bumper trims, so nice to see proper exhausts. There's an option on this car as well, about another 1200 quid I think for the extra sporting version. Makes even more noise, hopefully demonstrate in a bit. Inside, it's all very Audi. Which, if I'm going through my big book of Audi test drive cliches, means that it's very well made and it imbues you with a sense of self-confidence and perhaps even entitlement. How am I doing on my Audi cliches checklist? Well, better say something about tailgating later on in the video, so maybe once we get driving I'll do that. It feels very nice, it's very comfortable, it's very well equipped, it's very well stocked, as you'd hope so for a 78 grand car. It's a nice place to be, obviously. Now, the RS5 needs to be more than that though, doesn't it? It needs to be exciting. It needs to kind of stir you like some of those competitor products, and in a way that it hasn't done previously. Has it been successful? Only one way to find out. Okay, so here we are in the RS5 on a twisty B road, not its usual comfort zone, you would have to admit. So what have we got? Well, it's probably important really to start with the engine, because that's the biggest change, because visually this car looks quite similar to the previous RS5, doesn't it? In fact, you could park them next to each other and most people probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart. But that shift from a V8 to a V6 is really quite dramatic, and it has a similarly important effect on the way the car goes. So it's quite interesting with Audi, isn't it? Because a smaller turbocharged engine is perhaps more in keeping with its brand image than a naturally aspirated high revving V8. So much as we like that engine, this new one is kind of appropriate to Audi's heritage, and it also gives this new RS5 a decent turn of speed as well, because much as we like the old V8, it didn't really have enough torque for the old RS5 to get out of its own way, did it? I think it was only about 317 pound-feet up at about 5,000 revs. This new one's got 442, which is a hell of a lot more. Horsepower is the same, remember, but that torque transforms the way the car goes. Other important differences for this include a switch from the previous S-tronic dual clutch to a more conventional 8-speed auto. It's got a very similar drivetrain, so it's got the crown wheel differential front to back, which can just, is standard, I think is 40/60, but it can go more each way. It's got sport differential on the back, which is standard. That's a kind of fully active clutch type differential that sends power across the back, and previous experience shows that that has a really transformative effect on the way fast Audis go. It doesn't exactly turn them into drift machines, but it does at least make them a little bit more exciting, albeit only when you're at the kind of very extremes of performance. So the package is all good. This one has the optional Sport RS Sport suspension, which adds the DRC, which is the interlinked damper system, which has been on RS Audis for quite a long time. It links diagonal dampers across, so as the car lows one way, it supposedly stiffens it the other. Bit like the McLaren system, although not quite as complicated as that. It's got your usual kind of 3-level damping control. I've heard that the standard suspension on this car is a bit on the firm side. This one's got the 3 settings as you'd usually expect. It does give it a bit more range, but let's just come back to the engine because it's really, really important. And I think probably the best way to unleash a bit more of a sense of it is to drive in dynamic mode, which will make it a bit noisier. It opens up those flaps in the exhaust, and although it's only a 2.9 litre, it has got some real grunt about it, and it feels decisively turbocharged, which is, I don't think that's a bad thing for an Audi. I think that's really good, and I think to compete in this sector with cars like the M4 and the C63, you've got to have a kind of real kind of identifying character, and I think this one is going the right way about it. I think purists will always miss an actually aspirated V8, but the RS5 has always been quite a heavy car, and that really, really showed the lack of torque in the V8. So this one weighs, let's say, 70 kilos less than it was before, but it's over 1,700 kilos, so it's about 100 kilos heavier than an M4, for instance. So it's a chunky old car. But you still wonder, don't you? I mean, this is effectively, I think the RS5 should really be like an Audi GTR, because it's got a really punchy V6 turbocharged engine, it's got 4-wheel drive, it's got some clever transmission stuff. I think that's what an RS5 needs to be to stand out against the M4 and the C63. I'm not quite sure it's there, unfortunately. This is kind of, it's kind of got the power and torque of a 10-year-old GTR, hasn't it? And obviously the GTR has developed quite a lot in that period. The GTR is also a much, much more exciting and focused car to drive. So I'm a little bit left disappointed perhaps by how this car goes. I mean, it's very, very fast. I mean, the way it picks up speed is extraordinary. It kind of catches you unawares, really, because it's so refined most of the time that when you do put your foot down and suddenly everything gets a bit blurry, you're like, oh wow, this is a fast car after all. But I think that's kind of a failing, because in an M4 or a C63, you always know, even when you're just pottering around, you always know that you're in something a bit special. And that really, you need to feel like you're in something a bit special if you're spending this much on a car, don't you? But The problem with the RS5 is it kind of, in kind of 80 to 90% of its performance range, it just feels a bit ordinary, which is quite an Audi thing, isn't it? They always tend to just kind of hide the really exciting stuff until very, very high up in the performance range, and it just means you don't really get to enjoy the wow factor of being in a car like this, which, as I say, is what it should all be about. Dynamically, there are a few other disappointments as well. I mean, the steering, again, Audi, aren't you listening? Please give your car some decent steering. This one doesn't have the horrible wallowy dynamic steering, which is an option and was on the, I think it debuted actually on the previous RS5. I think that was the first car it came on. Instead it's got the passive steering, but it's a very, very lazy rack. It's about 16 to 1, I think, which, you know, the new Fiesta ST, that's 12 to 1, like a Ferrari. You don't need it to be super fast, you just need something to lean against, and that, when you drive a GTR, for instance, it's got an incredible front end, and that lets you play with the four-wheel drive and all those kind of clever chassis things that Nissan has engineered into that car. Audi's got all that stuff, but it's just, because you don't feel any incentive to kind of push hard against the front end or lean against it, it's kind of lost, really. It's all there, but you don't really get to enjoy it, so that's disappointing. The suspension is, as I say, I've not tried the passive option. I've heard it's not brilliant, but the dynamic ride control has been on some of the better RS Audis. Comfort feels a bit underdamped, I think. It almost scarily so, but then M4's like that as well. You know, you've got the kind of stiff springs, but it just kind of bounces around all over the place, almost worryingly at times. So comfort is maybe motorways only, really. The dynamic setting just feels a bit unnecessarily harsh. The auto mode, I think, is probably the best all-round compromise. The gearbox it's pretty snappy. I think, you know, we always go on about Audis having nice interiors, but I think one of the surprising weak points about this car actually is it's a little detail, but these shifter paddles feel awful. They're about the same as you'd get on an A1 or a Golf or a Polo or something like that. They're just little slivers of plastic, and they really don't do the car justice. And it's those little details in some of the rival cars. It's a part of the car you want to engage with. It's your connection with the gearbox. It should have some kind of substance about it. So to get in a car from a brand who one of its defining selling features is the fact that it makes good interiors, the fact that parts of the car that you're always interacting with feels so flimsy is just disappointing. Gearbox is alright. I don't think there's any great sacrifice in going from a dual clutch to an auto. It seems pretty responsive. My only bugbear is, and this is something again Audi seems to do throughout its performance products, is sometimes you come up to a corner and you want to just downshift one gear and it'll downshift 2 or 3. You know, you come up to a corner in first or second gear sometimes and you think, what, and a load of noise, you think, what the hell was all that about? I only wanted one gear. R8 does that as well. I don't know why Audi persists with these things. You would think that these criticisms, which come out every time we drive a fast Audi, which is to say steering's not great, these gearbox issues, do they not listen, or do they just not care? I mean, they sold 13,000 of the previous RS5 and that never had any particularly glowing reviews, so clearly Audi customers like the product, so, you know, who am I to complain, really? You've kind of detected a lot of moaning in this review, which is, it seems a little bit unfair because it's not a bad car, and I really like this new engine. I think it's quite an interesting power plant. It's got lots of cool technology like the inside-out turbos and things like that, and it punches out a lot of power for a small engine, and I think that's really cool. And that's it, there's lots of cool stuff about this car. I love the kind of visual references to the OR Quattro. It's a feel-good product, people love it, all the rest of it. But I think in a way that just seems to make its irritations even more annoying, because you think you've kind of nailed the big stuff. You've nailed the engine, you've nailed the looks, all, you know, all that, the heritage, all that kind of stuff, but it's almost as if they haven't driven the rival products like the M4 and the C63, which would seem daft to me because those are really, really strong products and the rivals that you would consider in this sector. So they must have driven them, and what did they think? Oh, well, you know, yeah, they're really exciting cars with really cool engines. Let's just make ours a little bit more boring. I don't know. So apologies if I sound really down on this car, because it's not a bad car, and in fact it's a lot better than the previous RS5. It's a little more engaging, it's a little more agile, and it's a little bit more interesting. But to return to the original question I set when I started the video, has Audi finally made a decent RS coupe? I'm afraid as far as a kind of driver's car, as a performance machine, it still hasn't. It's a great product, but it's still not really what I would have wanted out of an RS coupe.